Please subscribe, hit the like button, and let us know in the comments where you are watching from. My name is Isabel Chen, and I carried a thrift store bag to work while my coworkers mocked me daily for not affording luxury brands. What they didn't know was that inside that bag were documents proving they'd all falsified credentials, stolen intellectual property, and conspired to have me fired to hide their fraud. The laughter started the moment I walked into the office on Monday morning, carrying my new bag. It was a simple brown leather messenger bag I'd found at a thrift store for $12. Well-made, functional, with enough pockets for my laptop and files. I'd been proud of the find quality for almost nothing. "Oh my God, is that from Goodwill?" Jessica's voice carried across the open office space, loud enough for everyone to hear. I looked up to see her, Brandon, Melissa, and David, clustered by the coffee station, all staring at me with expressions ranging from amusement to disgust. "It's a nice bag," I said quietly, heading toward my desk. "It's a poor person's bag," Brandon said, not bothering to lower his voice. "Jesus, Isabel, we work at Cornerstone Dynamics. Have some professional pride. Get yourself something decent." "Some of us have student loans," I said, trying to keep my voice light, trying to pretend their mockery didn't hurt. "Some of us know how to manage money and present ourselves professionally," Melissa added, holding up her designer handbag like evidence. "Image matters in this business." They all carried luxury bags: Prada, Gucci, Louis Vuitton. Brandon drove a BMW. Jessica wore jewelry that cost more than my monthly salary. They lived in expensive apartments and took international vacations. I lived in a studio, took the bus, and carefully budgeted every dollar because I was still paying off massive student loans from the MBA program. I'd worked 2 jobs to complete. We all had the same job title, senior analyst, and presumably the same salary, but somehow they all had money to burn while I struggled to make rent. Maybe if Isabel spent less time in thrift stores and more time networking, she'd actually get promoted, David said, his comment drawing more laughter. I sat at my desk, my face burning, and opened my thrift store bag. Inside were my laptop, my lunch, and a stack of files I'd been reviewing over the weekend. Files that were about to change everything. I'd been passed over for promotion 3 times in 2 years. Each time, one of the 4 of them, Jessica, Brandon, Melissa, or David, had gotten promoted instead. Each time, I'd been told I was close but needed more experience, or wasn't quite ready. Meanwhile, they got raises, bonuses, and corner offices. They bragged about their success while treating me like I was beneath them, making comments about my clothes, my bag, my bus pass, and my packed lunches. What they didn't know was that I'd started investigating them 6 months ago when I noticed something odd in their performance reports. Numbers that didn't quite match, achievements that seemed exaggerated, credentials that didn't align with university records. I'd spent weekends researching, verifying, and cross-checking, used my access to HR files technically against policy, but my login worked and no one monitored access closely to review their personnel records. What I'd found was fraud, systematic, extensive, coordinated fraud. Jessica's MBA from Harvard, faker diploma was forged. Harvard had no record of her attendance. Brandon has 5 years of experience at Goldman Sachs before joining our company. Fabricated. He'd worked at a small regional bank, not Goldman, and for only 2 years. Melissa claimed to have published research papers in major economics journals. I'd tracked down the journals. Her name appeared nowhere. The papers she listed on her resume didn't exist. David's resume included consulting work for Fortune 500 companies that, when I contacted them, had never heard of him. All 4 had built their careers on lies, had gotten hired and promoted based on credentials and experience they didn't actually possess. They'd made more money than me, gotten better positions than me, treated me like garbage all while being frauds, but it was worse than just false credentials. I'd also discovered they were stealing. Our company, Cornerstone Dynamics, provided strategic consulting. Our work involved proprietary analysis methods, client data, and intellectual property worth millions. I'd found evidence that Jessica, Brandon, Melissa, and David had been copying client files, analysis frameworks, and proprietary reports, planning to leave Cornerstone and start their own competing firm using stolen intellectual property. They had meetings scheduled, business licenses filed under a shell company, even a domain name registered, Apex Strategic Solutions. They were going to steal our company's work, our clients, and our reputation, and they'd been planning it for over a year. The files in my thrift store bag contained proof of everything: forged credentials, falsified employment histories, evidence of the stolen intellectual property, and communications about their planned competing firm. I'd printed it all, organized it meticulously, prepared copies for company leadership, legal counsel, and, if necessary, law enforcement. But I'd also found something darker while investigating them: evidence that they'd been actively sabotaging me. 6 months ago, I'd been on track for promotion to the director level, recommended by my direct supervisor, who praised my work and strategic thinking. Then, suddenly, the recommendation was withdrawn. My supervisor called me into his office, looking uncomfortable, and told me there had been concerns raised about my performance and questions about my analytical capabilities. I'd been devastated, confused. My work had been exemplary. What had changed? Now I knew. I'd found the emails. Jessica had sent messages to senior leadership claiming I'd made critical errors in client reports, attached evidence reports with my name on them containing obvious mistakes. Except I'd never created those reports. Jessica had created fake versions, inserted errors, and framed me. Brandon had spread rumors to other departments that I was difficult to work with, wouldn't collaborate, and had anger issues. All lies, but effective ones. People started treating me differently. Melissa had gone to HR claiming I'd made inappropriate comments about her appearance, creating a documented complaint that went into my personnel file, a complaint based on conversations that never happened. David had undermined my client relationships by telling clients I was leaving the company soon, that they should work with him instead. Several clients had requested to switch analysts, damaging my performance reviews. They'd systematically destroyed my reputation and career prospects, and I finally understood why. They'd needed me to fail, so their own fraudulent success looked more legitimate by comparison. I was the control group, the person who was supposed to struggle while they thrived. But I'd also discovered something else: that were planning to frame me for the intellectual property theft. In their communications about starting Apex Strategic Solutions, there were discussions about leaving a trail that pointed to me, accessing files from my login, creating evidence that I'd downloaded proprietary information, setting me up to take the fall when Cornerstone discovered the theft. They were going to destroy my career completely, possibly have me prosecuted for theft I didn't commit, all while stealing millions in intellectual property and starting a competing business. And they'd done it all while mocking my thrift store bag. I spent the weekend finalizing my documentation, created a comprehensive report with sections for each person: their fraudulent credentials, their performance manipulation, their theft of intellectual property, and their planned frame-up of me. I included screenshots of emails, copies of forged documents with verification from the universities and companies they'd lied about, evidence of file access showing when they'd downloaded proprietary materials, and communications about Apex Strategic Solutions. Monday morning, I walked into the office with all of it in my $12 thrift store bag. Let them laugh. I didn't go to management immediately. I had a darker plan. I waited until Jessica, Brandon, Melissa, and David made their next move. According to their communications, they were planning to resign simultaneously next Friday and announce the launch of Apex Strategic Solutions the following Monday. They'd already poached 3 major clients who'd agreed to move their business to the new firm. 1 week. They had 1 week before they thought they were free, successful, untouchable. I spent that week laying groundwork. I contacted an attorney who specialized in corporate fraud and intellectual property theft, showed her everything. She reviewed the evidence with increasing satisfaction. "This is an open and shut case," she said. "Your coworkers have committed fraud in obtaining their positions, stolen intellectual property worth potentially millions, and conspired to frame you for their crimes. Your company could sue them into bankruptcy, and criminal charges are definitely possible. I want them destroyed," I said. "Completely, not just fired. I want them to lose everything and never work in this industry again." "I can help with that," she said with a smile. We prepared a legal package documenting everything. My attorney contacted the universities and former employers they'd lied about, got formal statements confirming they had no records of Jessica, Brandon, Melissa, or David, contacted the clients they'd stolen from, informed them their data had been accessed improperly and would be used by a competing firm without authorization. The clients were furious. Several immediately terminated their contracts with Cornerstone and threatened legal action, which my attorney noted would be redirected to the actual thieves once this was exposed. I also did something else. I contacted the landlords of the expensive apartments Jessica, Brandon, Melissa, and David lived in, asked casually about their rent, discovered they were all paying $3,000 to $4,000 per month, far more than our salaries could support. I investigated their financial records, public information, like property ownership, business filings, and court records, found that Brandon had filed for bankruptcy 3 years ago. Jessica had multiple judgments against her for unpaid debts. Melissa had been evicted twice. David had a car repossessed. They were all broke, living beyond their means, buried in debt. The luxury bags, the expensive cars, the lavish lifestyle was all financed by credit cards, loans, money they didn't have. They were desperate. This explained why they were willing to risk stealing intellectual property and framing me. They needed Apex strategic solutions to succeed because they were drowning financially. They'd mocked my thrift store bag while they were essentially homeless, wearing designer clothes they couldn't afford, drowning in debt while pretending to be successful. The irony was beautiful. Thursday afternoon, one day before their planned resignation, I scheduled a meeting with the CEO, the general counsel, and the head of HR. I brought my attorney, my evidence, and my $12 bag. I need to report fraud, theft, and conspiracy, I said, and laid out everything. They reviewed the documents for 3 hours. The CEO's face went from skepticism to shock to rage. The general counsel made phone calls to external attorneys. HR pulled personnel files and compared them to my evidence. This is catastrophic, the CEO said finally. 4 of our senior analysts have fake credentials, have been sabotaging other employees, and are planning to steal our intellectual property and clients. How long have you known? 6 months. I wanted to be certain before reporting. I knew they'd try to discredit me, so I needed irrefutable evidence. Why didn't you come forward sooner? Because I discovered they were planning to frame me for the theft. If I'd reported earlier, they might have accelerated their timeline and successfully made me the scapegoat. I needed to wait until I had proof of everything, including their intent to frame me. The general counsel nodded approvingly. You've potentially saved this company millions in losses and legal liability. The evidence you've gathered is meticulous. What happens now? I asked. Now we destroy them, the CEO said. Friday morning, Jessica, Brandon, Melissa, and David arrived at work, planning to submit their resignations. Instead, they were met by security and escorted to a conference room where the CEO, general counsel, head of HR, 2 police detectives, and I were waiting. Their faces went from confusion to fear when they saw me sitting there with my attorney and my thrift store bag. What's going on? Jessica asked, trying to sound confident. Sit down, the CEO said coldly. They sat. I watched them carefully, saw the moment they realized something was very wrong. The general counsel opened a folder. We've discovered that each of you obtained your positions at Cornerstone Dynamics through fraudulent means. Jessica, your Harvard MBA doesn't exist. Brandon, you never worked at Goldman Sachs. Melissa, your published research is fabricated. David, your consulting experience is entirely fictional. I watched their faces go pale. Brandon tried to speak, but the general counsel held up a hand. Additionally, we have evidence that you've conspired to steal intellectual property from this company, planned to start a competing firm using stolen materials, and actively sabotaged colleague Isabel Chen while planning to frame her for your theft. Jessica's eyes snapped to me. You, she hissed. You did this. I documented what you did. I corrected. You did this to yourselves. The police are here because what you've done constitutes criminal fraud and theft. The CEO continued. You'll each be charged accordingly. You're fired immediately. Effective now. Security will escort you to your desks to collect only personal items, no electronics, no files, nothing belonging to the company. Additionally, my attorney spoke up. My client will be filing civil suits against each of you for defamation, tortious interference with her career, and conspiracy. The company will be filing suits for fraud and theft of intellectual property. And I've contacted the clients you attempted to steal. They're also considering legal action. Melissa started crying. David looked like he might vomit. Brandon's usual arrogance had completely evaporated. This is insane, Jessica said, trying to recover. You can't prove any of this. I opened my thrift store bag and pulled out a thick folder, placed it on the table in front of her. Everything is documented. Every lie, every forged credential, every stolen file, every communication about Apex Strategic Solutions. I have screenshots, verified statements from the universities and companies you lied about. and access logs showing when you downloaded proprietary files. I have emails where you discussed framing me. I looked at each of them in turn. You spent 6 months making my life hell, mocking my clothes, my bag, my financial situation, sabotaging my career while stealing from the company, planning to frame me for your crimes. And you did it all while drowning in debt, living beyond your means, pretending to be successful while you were actually broke. You mocked my thrift store bag while you couldn't actually afford your rent. I leaned forward. That bag you all laughed at. It held the documents that are going to destroy your lives. How's that for irony? The police arrested them on the spot for fraud and theft. They were handcuffed and escorted out through the office in front of everyone who'd watched them mock me for months. Their co-workers stared in shock as Jessica, Brandon, Melissa, and David were perp-walked past their desks, handcuffed, crying, their perfect facade completely shattered. The criminal cases took 8 months to resolve. All 4 were convicted of fraud and theft. Jessica got 3 years in prison. Brandon got 4 years for additional financial crimes. Melissa got 2 years. David got 30 months, but criminal convictions were just the beginning of the destruction. The civil suits FIL led for defamation and career interference resulted in judgments totaling $800,000 they couldn't pay, so their wages would be garnished for decades. Cornerstone's intellectual property theft suit resulted in a $5 million judgment against them collectively. They'd never be able to pay it, but it ensured they'd never profit from their planned competing business. Their professional licenses were revoked. They were blacklisted in the industry. No consulting firm would hire them. After their fraud was publicized, I made sure it was publicized. I contacted industry publications, provided them with the full story. For senior analysts, used fake credentials to defraud company, steal IP. Ran as a major headline. Their names, photos, and crimes were detailed extensively. Their LinkedIn profiles were flagged and removed. Every Google search of their names returned pages about their fraud and convictions. But I didn't stop there. I took my revenge further. I contacted their landlords and provided proof that they'd likely been paying rent with fraudulently obtained money. Several landlords evicted them or sued for back rent. I contacted the luxury brands whose bags they'd carried and cars they'd driven, provided evidence that they were likely purchased with credit fraud. Several items were repossessed. I tracked down their families and sent them copies of news articles about the convictions. I wanted their parents, siblings, and friends to know exactly what they'd done. I destroyed their social media presence by commenting on old posts with links to articles about their fraud. Their friends abandoned them. Their networks evaporated. Jessica's fiancé broke off their engagement when he discovered her criminal conviction. Brandon's wife divorced him. Melissa lost custody of her daughter due to her incarceration. David's parents disowned him publicly. After they were released from prison, I hired a private investigator to monitor them. Every time one of them tried to use a fake name to get a job, I reported them. Every time they attempted to work in any professional capacity, I ensured their criminal history followed them. Jessica ended up working in fast food for minimum wage. Brandon became a security guard. Melissa cleaned houses. David drove for a rideshare service. All of them were buried in debt from the legal judgments, garnished wages, making it impossible to get ahead. Reputations so destroyed they could never return to professional work. Meanwhile, was promoted to the director level within a month of their arrests, given a significant raise, a corner office, and public recognition for saving the company from catastrophic losses. I was promoted again 6 months later to vice president. Within 2 years, I was chief operating officer, making 7 figures. I bought a house, paid off my student loans, started investing, built wealth they'd mocked me for not having, and I continued carrying my $12 thrift store bag to work, not because I couldn't afford a luxury bag guy. Could now afford 100 of them, but because I wanted to remember. I wanted to remember the day they mocked me for being poor while planning to destroy my career. I wanted to remember what they'd looked like handcuffed and crying. I wanted to remember that I'd built success honestly while they'd built lies. 5 years after their arrests, Jessica contacted me through a mediator, asked if we could meet, if there was any way I could help her, maybe provide a reference, help her find legitimate work, show some mercy. I sent back one message: "You spent 6 months making my life hell and planning to frame me for crimes I didn't commit. You mocked my second-hand bag while stealing from our company. I documented everything, turned you in, and watched you lose everything. Now you're living the life you thought I deserved, broke, struggling, unsuccessful. How does it feel?" Jessica never contacted me again. 7 years after their convictions, I heard through connections that all 4 of them were still struggling. Jessica had developed depression and substance abuse issues. Brandon had multiple failed relationships and was estranged from his children. Melissa had attempted suicide and was in and out of psychiatric care. David had basically given up, living in his parents' basement at 40 years old. They'd destroyed their own lives through fraud and greed. I'd just made sure they faced full consequences. Some people who knew the story suggested I'd been too harsh, that I should show forgiveness, that continuing to block their attempts at redemption was cruel. I disagreed completely. They'd committed fraud, stolen intellectual property, sabotaged my career, and planned to frame me for crimes that could have sent me to prison. They'd done it all while mocking me for being poor, for carrying a second-hand bag, for not living up to their fake standards of success. They deserved everything they got, and I deserved to watch them suffer the consequences. I still carry that $12 bag sometimes, even though I'm now CEO of a major consulting firm making millions. I carry it to remind myself that value isn't about appearance or price tags, that integrity matters more than image, that hard work and honesty ultimately prevail. But mostly I carry it to remember the look on their faces when they realized the bag they'd mocked contained the documents that destroyed them. They laughed at my second-hand bag. They didn't know it held their future, and that future was prison, poverty, and permanent ruin. I gave them exactly what they tried to give me. Nothing but consequences. And I sleep peacefully every night, knowing they got precisely what they deserved.